Morning, everybody. Let me make sure you can all hear me, and that I've got my clock up here so that I don't run over. Ooh, the one thing I don't have is a clicker to click forward, but that's all right. So we're going to just, all right. So I want to really thank, first of all, start off just by thanking the organizers of this conference for inviting me, and I've had the pleasure of attending sessions yesterday and this morning, and they've been fabulous. They've been so good, and I'm so my mind is blown by what a phenomenal community you have here in Minnesota and what a focus Minnesota appears to have on learning and e-learning. So I salute you. And thank you, Rebecca, for the nice introduction. So can you hear okay? It sounds kind of echoey up here, but it's all right out there. So before coming, being an academic, I decided to do some research on the state that I was going to, which I've only been to once before. And so I went to a site called You Know You're From Minnesota When, and I found out 3 things, and I want to fact check the information I got, because here in the political season, I think fact checking is increasingly important. So I found out, first of all, that you have an article of clothing called choppers. This is true? Like gloves, yes? I also found out that there's an expression of astonishment or dismay, oofda. Do you use it? I like it. Did I say it right? Oofda. And then finally I found out that there's a neighborhood in Minneapolis called Dinkytown. Thank you. And then it's named after, the streetcars were called Dinkies? Is that the source? Sorta? Okay. Anyway, this is a really amazing city and an amazing state, and you should be very proud. So here are my objectives for this session. To first of all talk about why I think online learning is ideally positioned to use the really rich, half a century long literature on learning and put it to good effect. And then identify 5 specific lessons that I think online learning has for teaching in general. I really think that online learning is in a position to lead in important ways on pedagogy across the board and andragogy. So I wanted to start off with a question. How many of you are teachers? So a fair number of you. Okay, so if you're a teacher, think about a teacher that you've had in your life who's inspired you or who has helped you become the teacher that you are. And if you're not a teacher, just think about a teacher who was important to you, who was a role model or was influential. So think about that until you've got a picture in mind of that person. Does everybody have one? Okay. So how many of you were thinking about an online teacher? Raise your hand if you were. 3 or 4. Okay, that's interesting. That's important. So now I want to ask you another question. Think about something you've learned recently. So something you've learned how to do, or a new body of knowledge. Maybe you learned how to cook Indian food. Maybe you learned about the geography of Africa, whatever it is. Think about something you've learned recently. Are you thinking of something? Okay. How many of you learned it in a classroom? Raise your hand if you did. That's fine. Classrooms are good places to learn. How many of you learned it out in the real world, doing something, kayaking or something like that? Okay, fair number. How many of you learned it online? That's a lot of hands. Okay, so I think this is actually really interesting. It creates a really interesting sort of juxtaposition where on the one hand, we lack models for online teaching. Most of our teachers were not online teachers. We don't have a picture in our head of what that looks like, in the same way that we do face-to-face on-site teaching. But at the same time, we have many, many models of online learning. We do it every single day. And so I think that combination of not many models for online teaching, many models for online learning is powerful. So it can create some discomfort, because if you're learning to teach online, you don't know what it's supposed to look like necessarily. But it's also really liberating. It really frees us up to reconceptualize what teaching can be, fundamentally. So I think that coming at this from the perspective of learning, because we all have learned in this modality, we can first of all be much more creative. You know, there are not well-worn paths here that we feel obliged to follow. You're kind of all frontiers people. So we can be more creative. I think it also helps us be more learner-centered because our starting point is learning. That's sort of where we're coming at this from. So it allows us to really think more about who we're teaching in addition to what we're teaching. And then I think it also really gives us an opportunity to use the research on learning. So these are some of my favorite books that synthesize, again, over 50 years of research in cognitive science and social psychology and anthropology and diversity studies on learning. These are all really good, and I kind of snuck my book in there next to Daniel Kahneman, who's like a Nobel Prize winner. But these are some really, really good books for making some kind of esoteric research palatable and understandable and applicable. And so I think online learning is in a good position to do that. What I think is really important to think about, though, is that despite the fact that we have all this research, it often is not applied in traditional classrooms, in on-site classrooms. We know, for example, that despite a lot of research questioning the effectiveness of lecturing, lecturing still holds steady as one of the primary modes of teaching. And as class sizes increase, maybe even more so. There are lots of misconceptions about learning styles that have been pretty roundly debunked by psychologists, and yet we continue to believe in them. There's some merit, which is part of why they're hard to debunk. And we continue to believe that if you load on more and more and more content, you get more and more and more learning, when there is a lot of evidence to show that that's not the case. If you haven't read, Craig Nelson wrote a fantastic little article called Dysfunctional Illusions of Rigor that is well worth finding and reading, where I think he teaches physics, pokes some holes in some of the kind of the general misconceptions that abound about learning and content coverage. So why is this? Why is on-site learning kind of resistant to change or resistant to incorporating learning research? I think that in large part it's because it's very traditional, it's very hidebound. This is a model of teaching that came literally out of the Middle Ages at a time when books were hard to access and you needed an expert pontificating as a kind of primary way to learn. There was certainly no internet. With online learning, though, I think that there's a whole new opportunity because this is a mode of teaching and learning that is just inventing itself. It's fairly new, not quite as new as it used to be, but it's fairly new. And so it brings new things into play. It has new affordances. It also has new limitations. And both those things, both what it offers and what it won't allow you to do, provide a way, it shakes things up. It provides new opportunities for thinking about what teaching can be. And it's also tied to technology, and technology changes rapidly, so it insists on responsiveness. So what I wanted to do is, wow, you really can't see the red very well there, can you? Note for next time. Red against black doesn't work. Okay, so what I want to do is talk about 5 lessons that I think all teachers can learn from online teachers and from online education. So we will have SpongeBob usher in 5 lessons. So the first lesson is, and I should be practicing this myself, step away from the lectern. Here I am up here talking about lectures and lecturing. There's a reason that lectures are popular. The lectures, first of all, are very efficient. You can get a lot of students into one room at one time. Also, from the teacher's perspective, there's something appealing about lecture because you can control everything. It's very predictable. I'm in charge. And so it's easy to see why lecturing is a popular form. It's also not terribly time-consuming to prepare a lecture or to give a lecture, so that there are efficiencies involved. And I'm actually not anti-lecture. I think that there is a place for lecture. I think it just needs to be a reduced place. But there's a lot of research that calls into question whether lecture really is very effective from the perspective of learning. If you're looking for a really good article, this Freeman article, which was in the publication of the National Academies of Science, is a meta-analysis of, I think, 200 other studies of lecture versus active learning. And what they found was that performance was significantly higher, 1.5 times higher with active learning than with lecture, and that failure was significantly higher with lecture than with active learning, to the point where they concluded in this article that what their conclusions were is if this were a clinical trial, if this was a study of 2 different interventions, the lecture one would have to be discontinued for benefit, that it does not have enough benefit to ethically allow it to continue. And so those were kind of strong words. Hake has also found that it doesn't really matter whether you're a good lecturer or not, that the benefits of lecture are the same, whether you're a really accomplished lecturer or not. And then there's new research coming out, Eddy and Hogan, that implies that there are gender differences and racial ethnic differences in terms of how effective lecture is, and that women and minorities are more disadvantaged by lecture than white men. So there's a lot of reason to believe that lecture is problematic and that we should look carefully at its use. I've heard one person compare learning a discipline from lectures is like learning to drive from the passenger seat of a car. It can only get you so far. It's a good start, though. You have to, at some point, sit in the passenger seat. So what about online? So one of the things I've found with online education is it's not that easy to lecture. Particularly if you're relying on video lecture, it's difficult to produce video. It's not nearly as simple as sort of preparing what you want to say and going into a room and delivering it. It's kind of nerve-wracking. It's hard to get the same sort of energy. How many of you have tried lecturing on video? Have you found that? Some people are good at it. Me, I've struggled. You know, it's hard to feel like there are people out there and to kind of get your mojo when you are lecturing to a camera. They're also difficult to change. It's a very rigid format. Once you've put a lecture in the can, you can reuse it, but it's not that easy to update it or to make changes. So lecturing's not that easy to do online. And I think that, that one of the things that leads to, naturally, are these things. One is to use lecture more sparingly, that I think this is a lesson that comes out of online learning that the rest of the world could also use, is just use lecture less, depend on it less, find other ways to reach students and to engage students. And to keep lectures short. There's research that shows that hour-long lectures are deadly in really any modality, but in video for sure. And so there's an emerging literature that talks about sort of what's the optimal length given students' attention. And also, when you do lecture online, you can take out a lot of filler, a lot of repetition, you can boil it down, you can prioritize. I think it really makes us think harder about what is our key message and how do we get it across concisely. We can also use what's already out there. I mean, there's so much available on the internet that is useful in almost any field. You know, there's shows like Brain Games and Vsauce and TED Talks are really a rich source, and I'm sure you guys know this. I've been going to enough sessions to know that you guys are very inventive and very resourceful and creative, and you're probably way ahead of me on any of this. But even for some really pretty heady academic subjects, I teach in a school of medicine with graduate students learning clinical research methods, there's still a ton out there. There's a ton from the NIH website. There's a lot of material on medical writing basics, cringeworthy efforts and errors and how to avoid them. There are lots of things you can pull from. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Well, you don't always. Okay. Another thing, I think another lesson from this is that online, it's a good method to ask students rather than tell them. Rather than feel like your role is to synthesize everything and hand it to them tied neatly with a bow, send them out to find the answers. Rather than do a lecture on the common errors in NIH applications, why don't I ask my students to go find out what are the common errors in NIH applications and bring them back? And then we can look at them together and go through them together and decide which ones are the most important and which ones are erroneous and go from there. This is something I like to call sort of scavenger learning. That I think that send your students out on hunts and have them come back with the information. It empowers them, it surprises you. It's always good as a teacher to be surprised by what your students find, rather than knowing all the answers in advance. So one of the things that this put me in mind of is in 2004, I went on semester at sea, which was a program at that point in the University of Pittsburgh with a ship that sails around the world with 700 students and a bunch of classrooms on it, and you teach on the ship, and then you dock in ports, and students go out into ports and learn amazing things. And I was able to do that, teach 3 anthropology courses on this ship. It was an amazing experience. And what I realized was I could spend my time in class lecturing, I could give students lots of readings, I could give them lots of writing assignments, and what a waste that would be. Because they were out in the world. Do I want them in their cabin writing, or do I want them in Shanghai, roaming the streets? So in that moment, I sort of realized that we can't let teaching get in the way of learning. That we have to be careful not to insert ourselves too much into the equation, and we need to let them go out into the world and explore it, and bring back what they learn and help them make sense of it. So some lessons for teaching then in any modality is limit your use of lectures, keep lectures short, use what's out there, and when you can, ask rather than tell. So Borat gives that the double thumbs up. Second lesson, make students do the heavy lifting. So this is one of my favorite quotes about learning, and this is from Herb Simon, who's considered sort of the father of cognitive science, and he's a Nobel Prize winner in economics. He said, learning results from what the student does and thinks, and only from what the student does and thinks. The teacher can advance learning only by influencing what the student does to learn. So the takeaway from that is we can't do the learning for them. They have to do the work. And so the only thing we can do as teachers is create the conditions that prompt students to do the work of learning. And I think that's an important message. And the beauty of online learning is that the digital world is such a rich one that it promotes this, what Jenkins and company call participatory culture. That with Web 2.0 tools and the things that are available to us out there, there are really low barriers to artistic expression. Students can build things, they can make things, they can make beautiful things on the web easily. There are low barriers to civic engagement, so students can be involved in interesting movements. There's a lot of support for creating and sharing. That is the world that they're in. And they can shape the flow of media. So these are kind of heady times for teaching. They allow a lot of interesting things. And I think what we've seen from Arab Spring, we've seen from Black Lives Matter, that what we see and what students see is that young people can say important things about important things and really make a difference in their world. And if we're not harnessing that, we're losing an opportunity. We're lecturing on the ship, basically, instead of sending them out into port. So what kinds of things can we do? These are things that I'm sure some of you already do. We can send them out there into their communities and workplaces. That's another really amazing thing about online, is students aren't in the sort of rarefied environment of a campus. They're out in their communities, they're in their workplaces, and we can use that in assignments and opportunities for reflection, have them sort of document public, or public art, or architectural styles, or environmental problems, and relate what they're learning to their own environments in ways that I think are very powerful. Have them develop social media campaigns, or evaluate fitness apps on their phones. There's so many ways that they can be involved in real things, evaluating real things and saying real things, or writing blogs for Medium or WordPress for broader audiences than just their teacher. That's powerful too. Another thing about online, how many of you have ever noticed that you never learn anything as well as when you teach it? Like there's something about teaching things that makes it clear and comprehensible in a way it never was. And there's a word for that, it's called the protege effect. It's been demonstrated in research that students learn more when they teach others than when they simply learn for themselves, because it gives them a sense of responsibility for the content. They really have to understand it deeply, and they have to consider their audience. When you teach, you have to think about what do they already know, what do they need to know. There's a story in the book Conquering the Content by Robin Smith, good little book on online learning, where she was teaching an online anatomy and physiology class where one of the lessons involved learning the anatomy of a cat. And a student came to her and said, you know, we'd learn this a lot better if we had a video on cat anatomy. And she said, okay, create one. And so her students created a video of cat anatomy for the next semester's students. The next semester's students saw the video and said, we can do better than that, and created a better video on cat anatomy, and then it became part of the assignments for the class, that students taught one another cat anatomy by using these tools to create things. So what I think I'm actually asking you to be is lazier. I'm giving you permission to be lazier. You know, that in some ways, as teachers, we're more effective when we do less for our students and make them do more for themselves. And as you probably also know, you actually can't be lazy to be lazy as a teacher. That it takes a lot of work to develop the kinds of assignments and opportunities for students to do the heavy lifting. So it's only sort of illusory laziness there. Okay, so if we're summarizing there, the lessons, have students create content, have students teach one another, and do less and make students do more. This is easier said than done. Of course, I can stand up here and tell you what to do, and doing it is actually trickier, but okay, the third lesson then, as I see it, and I'm sure you guys could add a lot of lessons to this group of 5, there's much more to say, just not enough time to say it, is that we can take a cognitive load off students. This is another place where I think online learning is way ahead of the curve. So how many of you have seen websites like this one? I know that you probably can't see very clearly from the back. Truly ugly, badly organized, chaotic websites. What's the experience like of trying to find information there? Frustrating. It's frustrating. Maybe you never get to the information that you want. It causes a lot of angst. It's just an unpleasant kind of situation. And you can contrast that to, and I'm really sorry that you probably can't see very well, can you? There's a lot of glare on. You can see it? Okay. Really? So if you compare that to good websites, websites that are kind of clean and clear, where the navigation is logical, where it's visually enticing, it's a completely different experience. I wish I could show you this in real time. This is this amazing website for, I think it's a jewelry store, where you can move all through this elaborate drawing. You can move to the left and the right, and things open, and it's magical. It's just this kind of incredible experience. But I think that what we know from our own experience online is that beautiful learning environments matter, that aesthetics matter, that design matters for how we interact with it, our motivation to stay engaged with it, and what kind of information we can pull out of it and learn from it ultimately. And this really brings us to the research on cognitive load, which you're probably fairly well aware of. But what we know from cognitive research is that while long-term memory is big and can hold a lot of things, if they're well reinforced and learned repeatedly, it's kind of like a library, working memory is really limited. Working memory is like a crowded little desktop where if you put too many things on it, other things fall off and you can't find anything anymore and it becomes unworkable. There simply isn't a lot of space in working memory. And so we have to really be conscious of how much clutter we throw into the equation. You know, how many impediments we give to getting to where you want to go. And so cognitive load theory really deals with cognitive load, which is how much demand do we place on our working memory. And it starts with the recognition that excessive cognitive load, too much stuff coming at you, too much stuff to kind of process, compromises learning and performance. That if you are trying to juggle and chew gum and ride a skateboard at the same time, you're probably not going to do all those things well. And so it differentiates between germane cognitive load, which is the cognitive load involved in the task itself, the difficulty of doing something that is intellectually challenging, that's good, and extraneous cognitive load, which is the load that comes from distractions and things that are not germane to the task, things that are just sort of extra. And that's what a bad website can do. It throws in a lot of extraneous cognitive load. I want to show you, good thing nobody from my university is here. This is an actual slide from a presentation I went to in my department not too long ago, with the names concealed to protect the not innocent. But look at that slide. That thing is a catastrophe. And all the slides in the deck were like this. There were, logos everywhere. There was big, huge blocks of text. It was the most jangly kind of thing you can imagine. And so what this shows me is there is a tremendous amount that on-site teachers also have to learn about cognitive load and about aesthetic design of course materials, of slides, of syllabi, of assignments and course documents, never mind websites and LMSs. So, I think this is something. That's odd. My slide disappeared. Just did. It doesn't matter. This is something I think that people in the online world know. That you know that the experience of being in an ugly LMS where things are cramped and busy and crowded and the navigation is non-intuitive is a frustrating experience that gets in the way of learning. That was just that. Maybe I clicked on the image by mistake. It's back. We're good. But how different it is to be in an environment where things are well organized, where they're clean, where they're open, where there's white space, and where you know where your eye is supposed to go and it's easy to find things. So the difference that it makes online of having a well-designed, well-organized, intuitive, clean, elegant kind of environment is so present and so obvious. In the online world, but it isn't in the on-site world. Syllabi can be a disaster. Course documents can be a disaster. Finding what you need to find in an assignment to do it well can be impossible. This is something that I think that we all, as educators, need better training in. How to create better slides. I saw some beautiful slides this morning, so I realize I have a lot to learn. But creating beautiful slides, creating beautiful documents, using visual design principles. Are any of you aware of the online learning manifesto that the University of Edinburgh wrote? If you're not, find it, because it's kind of exciting. It's this manifesto with all these, these sort of principles of online learning. And one of them, I have this on the wall of my office, because when I'm feeling like depressed about online learning, I look at it and I get excited. One of the tenets of this manifesto is the aesthetics of online course design are too readily neglected, and courses that are fair of interface are better places to learn and teach. And the only thing I would add to that is just to take out online, because this is true across the board. That beauty matters, aesthetics matter. When you navigate, a site like Medium, a really beautiful kind of blogging site, you see it, we recognize it. What we need to do now is learn how to produce it. And that didn't come as part of anybody's PhD training unless you happen to be a designer. And so this is a new set of skills for all of us to get. So some of the lessons for teaching then in any modality are to make sites and slides and documents beautiful, to attend to the aesthetics of learning, because I think they really are underestimated and important, and to learn and incorporate design principles. There really was an excellent session this morning about website design, LMS design, and how students navigate it differently than how we expect them to. So there's a lot that we can learn there. All right, I'm gonna ask you another question. So the fourth lesson, make climate change your business. So what this really refers to is classroom climate. So think back to that thing that I asked you, the thing that you learned that I asked about earlier. So was the last time you really learned something new. How did you feel when you were learning it?
Excited.
Excited.
Curious.
Curious.
Satisfied.
Satisfied? What's that?
Empowered.
Empowered. Anybody feel frustrated at times?
Yeah.
Intimidated? Okay, all those things are often involved in learning, because learning is really very tied in with social and emotional issues. That these things are not peripheral to learning. And there is a slew of research that supports this. We know that social interactions facilitate learning, that if students can talk about what they're learning, if they process it together, if they have to articulate what they what they mean, they learn it more deeply, they retain it longer. That listening to something isn't nearly as powerful as having to produce something based on it in a social interaction. I think we also know that social obligations create accountability, that if students know one another in a course, if they know you, the teacher, they feel some obligation to be in class, they feel some obligation to contribute, that kind of creates a glue and a motivation for accountability. I think we also know that relationships pave the path into disciplines. How many of you got into your discipline because of a person, a faculty member or a person who showed you what it was like to be an anthropologist or to be a scientist? Or, yeah, it's those relationships with professionals in a discipline that I think show students a way and get them excited about being that or doing that. We've seen that positive emotions promote learning. You know, when you are excited, when you are motivated, when you feel that kind of thrill of mastery, you want to learn more. And we've also seen that negative emotions can really discourage learning. Fear, anxiety, sometimes they're a motivator, but sometimes they can be very discouraging as well. This would take a whole other session, so there's not time to get into it, but if you're interested in this, there is such cool research coming out in sort of the social psychology of learning. So, you know, you're probably aware of the instructor immediacy work that really shows that the warmth and welcoming kind of affect of a teacher makes a huge difference to whether students engage with the material, seek help. It has big learning ramifications. But there's really interesting stuff on stereotype threat. How many of you have heard of stereotype threat? If you go back to that set of books that I had up there, there's one called Whistling Vivaldi that goes over what a lot of this really interesting research, especially around stereotype threat. There's research on reappraisal, which is a cool one. I actually did this morning. All right, I'll tell you. Hopefully, we're not out of time. If you can get students to sort of reframe nervousness and anxiety as excitement, it changes the whole equation. If you can get them, even if it's a lie, to say, I'm excited about this test, it changes, it takes all those jittery feelings that come with nervousness and reframes them as something positive. I always do that around public speaking because it makes me really nervous. So I was like, I'm excited. There's research on if-then planning, which is interesting. You know the research on social presence. There's great, really, really rich research on motivation. And grit, which are sort of the non-cognitive factors that lead to success in student learning. And one of the reasons I think that people in the online world pay more attention to this is the stakes are higher. When students in your classes are disengaged or feel alienated or don't feel part of a community, they leave. Attrition is higher. It's a bigger issue online. So this isn't peripheral. You don't have a captive audience the way you do in an on-site class. So you have to think about these things. And I think that that actually is something that we all ought to be thinking about a whole lot more in our on-site classes as well, is how to make people feel included, how to build a sense of community, how to create a welcoming environment that's also really intellectually challenging, you know, and how to invite disagreement without things getting ugly. And good tools are essential for doing this, and good opportunities for asynchronous interaction. This is a tool called Flipgrid. If anybody's used this, I would love to get the skinny on how Flipgrid works for you, so maybe we can talk. I love the idea. It's a sort of a video-enabled discussion board, discussion forum. Or VoiceThread. I went to another good session yesterday that was all about VoiceThread in an architecture course. You know, ways for students to engage with one another and to create a sense of community and accountability and presence within classes where students are actually physically not present. Social media, I think, has got enormous, you know, power and potential when it comes to learning. I also went to another session yesterday just about how to use Google Drive and all the sort of the suite of Google tools to create courses, and you know, that's really powerful. And Randy Bass was talking yesterday, wow, it's really hard to see this, but he showed this Venn diagram that his wife had come up with that I really like. The idea that our responsibility is to help students develop knowledge of the domain, knowledge of the world, and knowledge of themselves, and to take responsibility for all of that. But we often, a lot of teachers think this is their sole responsibility, it's the blue circle. And I think that what online learning brings again is the knowledge that we can't just attend to the blue circle, we have to attend to the whole person, and we have to think about the social and emotional issues in teaching and learning. and build these kinds of communities. So the lessons there are that we should proactively connect with students, that this doesn't just happen automatically or necessarily in an online class. You have to make it happen. And that's what on-site can learn from that. And that we have to help students connect with one another, and that we have to make it our job to create community. This is our responsibility. It's important. And then finally, fifth lesson is to use common senses. So my discipline is cultural anthropology. And this is a discipline that is full of sensory information. You know, when cultural anthropologists are working abroad, there are smells and colors and sights and textures that are involved in the experience of encountering another culture that are a good part of the information that you're getting and the knowledge that you're getting. But this is what anthropology tends to look like in school. Readings, books, maybe occasionally an ethnographic film shown. And these are sort of the environments in which we do that learning. They're fairly arid kinds of classroom environments that have to serve lots of masters, so you can't, like, you know, put things on the walls or make them particularly interesting. They're sort of intentionally generic. And that again seems to me like a waste, especially because the research shows that when we can involve more senses in learning, then information gets connected in more different ways, more richly encoded, as they call it, and we learn it more deeply and retain it longer. So we learn best when using multiple senses. We know from research by Richard Mayer and others that visual images are more powerful than words, that we tend to remember them longer. And so we ought to be engaging more of the senses in learning, not just anthropology, but medicine, business, everything. This is just a picture. This is actually, I just like the picture. It's a picture of Velcro up close. That's what Velcro looks like. But I put this up there because I think the issue is we have to create these hooks for information to stick to. That information is stickier when you use more senses in the learning of it. So when I think about anthropology, I think about what can be learned, first of all, on the web. So, if I want my students to learn something about like Gullah basket weaving, the resources on the web are so rich, so much more than I could bring easily into the classroom. Hmong shamanism maybe, they can go to the web, they can find videos, they can find testimonials, they can find images. Maasai initiations, the same thing. There's just so much out there. But then the other thing, again, is that students are in their own communities and their own workplaces. And so the other really rich opportunity is to send them out to observe and to use their senses in those places, to apply the lens of their discipline to thinking critically and thinking disciplinarily about what they're seeing, and again, to bring those experiences back and to help make sense of them. If your students happen to be overseas, so much the better. I had a great conversation the other day with somebody, I saw him out there just a minute ago, there you are, who'd won an award yesterday for a project involving COIL that linked up instructors from different cultures and their students to have this really rich sort of collaborative learning opportunity across cultures. It's like, wow, what an opportunity. And we never got that before. This is something that digital tools enable that were not possible in the past. So lessons there are to try to tap the multisensory resources of the web, the multimedia resources of the web, to utilize students' own environments and just try when you can to bring more senses into the experience of learning. Okay, so let me just recap, because we're getting to the end here. So these are the 5 lessons that I thought to bring, and maybe in the Q&A session you can think of other lessons that you think online could teach the rest of the teaching world. Step away from the lectern. Again, I feel like I've got to do that. Make students do the heavy lifting of learning. Take extraneous cognitive load off as much as you can through the careful, thoughtful design of learning environments, documents, and materials. Make climate change your business by really taking responsibility for the climate of a classroom. Students also have a responsibility in that, but you have a responsibility to help them. And to use common senses as much as you can. So I want to close with one caveat, though, which is that just because this can be done online doesn't mean it is done. And there can be hideous, horrible courses online, as you all know from your own observations, that in many respects it's easier to be bad and harder to be good online. It takes more resourceful teaching, more ingenuity. And what I've seen just through this conference is so heartening in that there is so much energy and creativity and resourcefulness and sharing that is going on here, that it really gives me a tremendous amount of hope for where we can take this and the kind of the potential of online learning for really revolutionizing teaching in general. So I just want to praise you all, give yourselves a shout out, give yourselves a hand, and I'm excited to see what you can do and just want to say, lead the way. So that's what I have to say, and I'm happy to take questions if...
Questions?
Or comments, or additional things that you'd add to the list of lessons. Anybody? I'm going to feel bad if you don't have something to say.
Thank you, Dr. Norman, for your presentation, your thoughts. And I think, again, it resonated with me from my comments this morning, too, that this is the fundamental shift we have to be thinking about, not just online learning, but other ways that students learn, so that, again, they have an education that fits for them. And that means the pedagogy changes as well in the classroom. That's not easy. For those of us who were in the classroom 30 years ago, Mary and I were just talking about, when you asked a question about online learning, my first year in the classroom, there's a thing called a punch card.
Wow.
All right? So we've come, long distances in just a few decades in terms of where kids are at. Think about another 30 years.
Yep.
And where we're going to be at that point in learning in the needs of kids at that time. So again, for me, it's really joggled a lot of things in my mind about how to approach alternative types of learning and teaching for kids, but it is about the learning, and the teaching becomes the facilitation of that learning. And that's a paradigm. When I first got in the classroom, boy, I lectured with the best of them.
Yep.
I lectured till they just fell off their chairs dead to the world, because that's what we thought how they learned. And then I started doing labs with them, and the kids were literally pushing me out of the way and saying, no, let us do this lab.
Yeah.
And that resonated throughout my career. And it was almost like, we're going to lecture today. Are you going to learn something? Let's take a quick quiz. No, they didn't learn a thing. Let's do a lab, and then I'm going to ask you a quick quiz. And it was amazing how the difference in those quick assessments between those two modalities. Some kids love lectures, they love papers. By all means, run with them. But there's a lot of other learning styles here that kids can exhibit and really excel in other types of modalities. So thank you again for your message today and opening up all of our minds and thoughts about that. And I'm going to pass it right over to Mary, if that's all right. And then there's a question, gentleman over here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Norman. I just had a comment too. One of the things that I've noticed, I teach adults, I do professional development for teachers, but one of the things that I've noticed too is that we've been trained to do school really well. So sometimes when you do shake it up and put more emphasis to the student on taking responsibility, sometimes they don't quite know what to do with that.
Yeah.
So just an observation.
Absolutely. I think it requires a lot of structure to leave them on their own. Yes. And it's developmental. It really depends on where they are developmentally. You can't, you can throw graduate students out into a less structured environment than you can undergrads or younger students. So it really depends a lot on who they are. And that's the hard part of being lazy. That's the work-intensive part. Yeah.
A sixth potential lesson.
Yeah.
And that is do team education. Mm-hmm. That I think a paradigm shift is, many of us were trained as the sage on stage, the one person in the room. Yep. It was our responsibility to do this. Now, to be effective and to address the other ones, it has to be a team approach. Yeah. in order to do that. Absolutely.
What's interesting, and this, Rebecca and I were having a conversation earlier, that's been the approach in some other cultures from the beginning. In some Asian schools, teaching has always been a team effort. that teachers work collectively to develop curricula and things like that. So I agree that that's a paradigm shift, but a powerful one. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Norman, for your comments.
Where am I looking?
Right
Hold on.
here.
There you are. Oh, hi.
Right here. I'd be interested in your take on the same question I asked Randy Bass yesterday. Where does OER fit into this scenario?
OER is a really, really interesting, powerful movement. I think it has, you know, in my slide about kind of using what's out there as opposed to creating everything yourself, I think that the sort of culture of sharing that students are already part of is going to become something that faculty are more part of. And that creating really good resources and sharing them is going to be important, which means they have to be carefully collected and compiled and organized and easy to find. But I see that as a really positive development and an exciting one, you know. So does that get at what your focus was? Yeah, to me, that's really, really good stuff. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Charles LaRue. I'm an adult basic education teacher, and I graduated from the University of Minnesota, and Flipgrid was developed at the University of Minnesota.
Oh, it was?
By professors there. And so I want to give them credit for that.
Yeah.
And if you want to do that. And my question is, with the increase in state standards and competencies and those long lists that everybody's looking at now, is that adding, you know, more knowledge for less results? Do you think that this massive standards that are coming down on everybody and saying we have to teach all this stuff to these people or they won't be well educated, is that really helpful?
I think it probably depends on what the standards are. If they really are this sort of content-heavy set of standards, I think it can lead us backwards. If they're broader sets of standards that allow for some interpretation, if you think of Randy's slide about those hard skills, I love that he called them hard skills, about creativity and critical thinking and resilience and ethics and empathy, if they're broad like that and can be achieved in different ways, I'm more in support of them. But if they're nickel and dime kinds of content standards, I'm a lot more skeptical because I think that leads back towards lecturing, sort of death by content, less deep opportunities for active learning. So I'm not sure what they look like here. I think there's a lot of potential for harm, but there's some potential for good as well. Does that, yeah.
As a comment on that, I'm one of the people in the back office, instructional design, academic technology, faculty development, and I would encourage anybody who's in that sort of role to simply replace the word students with faculty in your notes as far as helping out your efforts for faculty development. Very good.
So true, and thank you, yes. Faculty are learners too, and this just applies to learners. So any last thoughts? I know you guys are probably hungry and eager to get to lunch, but it looks like there's maybe one more.
I just wanted to say that I appreciated what you were saying about all learning is emotional. From some perspectives, certain disciplines or certain faculty may feel uncomfortable with that conversation. It's either scary to sort of realize that how you are or what you do, the instructor immediacy behaviors, the things that we were talking about are really important. Would you have any advice to faculty or to disciplines in entering into a conversation about strategies or having that discussion?
Let me make sure I understand. So having a discussion about how to sort of manage the emotions around learning or helping students?
No, actually just to sort of open that conversation. Having that conversation can be difficult. To realize that how you are as an instructor in front of your students makes a difference, and maybe you don't have those kinds of behaviors, or you're uncomfortable, you're not sure how to make, if you will, maybe a positive emotional connection with students, or certain disciplines are focused on logic, you know, emotion really shouldn't be there or something.
Yeah. That's a good question, because I do think that faculty are not always comfortable with that idea, that they really are there just to present the information, just the facts, or that's how they see it. I think what I've found is when you remind faculty of what it's like for them to have been learners, when you put them back into the position of remembering what it was like to learn something, it's a lot easier for them to connect to that idea. If we're in their faculty hat, then they're like, I'm just here to teach the content. But if you remind them that when they were learning how to do rowing the other day, or we're teaching themselves something new, that how they felt at the time matters, and how other people manage the emotions in a room matter. It's a tricky conversation with some faculty, but I think that if you can remind faculty of themselves as learners, you get farther in that conversation. Yeah.
Thank you for your comments, very insightful. I'm Elias Mokel. I'm an instructor of music at the School of Fine Arts in University of Minnesota Duluth. And sort of the performative aspect of teaching really resonates with me. And the idea of, I teach an applied area, so doing is super, super important. But I read a book a couple of years ago called Teaching with Your Mouth Shut.
Yes, yes.
So it's that kind of idea where you step back. I mean, students might have a class with me and go, oh, he's really interesting and got a good personality, but did they really take away the knowledge, or were they more interested in that sort of performative aspect of it? And I found that what you spoke about with first year, I teach a first year course.
Yeah.
And I find that if I guide them properly and I'm lazy properly, like that guy on the couch, if I do that stuff right, they will open up a bit. Because I hear a lot of verbiage that says, oh, first year students, they can't handle that yet. But if we open that up, that prepares them for each level of the journey, where the course content is obviously different than the content that's in a first year course. So thank you very much for addressing those issues.
I agree. And I think that the way you said that is good. You open it up for them to help shape the content. What you don't do is let them flounder. One of the things that Herb Simon said is the only thing you learn from floundering is how to flounder. So it has to be structured enough so that they're not just flailing, but that there's space for creativity and surprises. As a teacher, when your students can surprise you, when you don't know what they're going to say, that's when it's fun. So you don't want it all kind of too tight in the classroom. All right. Thank you all very much. I really enjoyed being here.